Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another Instant Deck Tech. So, as you know, Wednesday means Wildcard Wednesdays here at Instant Deck Tech Land, and today we are heading back to Legacy for one of the meanest decks, probably in any format, in Magic's history. This is Legacy Stax, and if you want to make your opponent miserable and make a game go a really long time until you probably win by your opponent scooping out of frustration, potentially with no permanents on the battlefield, this might be the deck for you. A quick reminder before we break down the deck, which by the way recently took a Magic Online user by the name of No666 to a 5-0 finish in a competitive league. Anyway, if you enjoy this deck and you want to see it made into videos, take a minute, click the like button, the subscribe button, leave a comment, anything you can do to support your deck, because whichever deck is most popular gets a shot at being made into videos next week. So, Legacy Stax gets its name primarily from smokestacks, also because it stacks up a lot of really hateful effects on the battlefield. So smokestack is a card that costs 4 mana, but you can play this as early as turn 1 or turn 2 in this deck with a really good draw. And it says that during each player's upkeep, they sacrifice a permanent for each soot counter on smokestack, and during your upkeep, you get to put a soot counter on smokestack if you choose to. So basically, it does nothing right away. On your turn after you play smokestack, you can put a counter on it. So then on your opponent's next upkeep, they're going to have to sack a permanent. You will also have to sack a permanent, and you can choose again the next turn to put another counter. The trick is, this deck has some ways to mitigate the damage and break the symmetry of smokestack. Primarily, the way the deck does it is Crucible of Worlds. So if you get a smokestack with 1 counter on it, each player on their upkeep has to sack a permanent. If you have a Crucible of Worlds, you can just sack a land and then replay that land every turn, while your opponent is likely not going to have Crucible of Worlds, and they're going to have to sack a real permanent. So as the game goes along, you're not really losing any resources, while your opponent is slowly being drained away of their resources. Better yet, if you have God's Eye Gave the Riki, you can take and not only sack your land every turn, but you get a 1/1 spirit, so you get a chump blocker out of it, or you can even win by beating down with those spirits eventually. Drown Your Temple kind of does the smokestack combo all on its own, even without Crucible of Worlds. It's a little expensive because you gotta pay 3 mana to return Drown Your Temple from your graveyard to the battlefield, but theoretically every turn you can sack Drown Your Temple to smokestack, pay 3 mana, get it back, next turn sack it again. So again, you're not using any resources or losing any resources, while your opponent is slowly getting their board eaten away by the smokestack. The other aspect of this deck that's really important is fast mana. So it has a lot of really powerful, hateful effects, but Legacy is a really fast format, so you want to get these things down on turn 1, on turn 2, on turn 3, a little bit faster than their actual mana cost. So Mox Diamond works well with the deck's plan of having 4 Crucible of Worlds. It's kind of a free roll because you can always get that land that you discard to Mox Diamond back later, and it lets you have 2 mana on turn 1. Essentially, you play your land, that's 1, Mox Diamond, discard another land, get that land back later with Crucible, 2 mana. You can start playing things like Mindstone, for example, for even more ramping. And then you also have Metalworker, which can tap for just a ton of mana, because you reveal artifacts in your hand, and you get 2 mana for each artifact that you reveal that way. So you're often going to tap Metalworker for 4, 6 mana, and that lets you play a ton of stuff really early in the game. So these cards kind of ramp you up. You also have lands that tap for 2 mana, so this lets you play like your Metalworker on turn 1. If you can play Ancient Tomb, Mox Diamond, discard a land, that's 3 mana. There's your Metalworker. The next turn, you're probably going to have like 7 mana or something. Just empty your hand really quickly. City of Traders kind of does the same thing. Taps for 2 mana, so you get a total of 8 2-mana lands. And then we have all the hateful cards. So Chalice of the Void can beat some decks on its own. On 0 is powerful in some matchups. On 1 is powerful in a ton of matchups. It locks out like Delver decks almost completely. And then since you can make so much mana, you can also cast this for like X2, X3, depending on what your opponent's deck is. Trinisphere is another one of those super powerful turn 1 plays. Basically, while the wording is pretty crazy, essentially anything that you cast, or your opponent casts, costs at least 3 mana. There's no way around it, no matter what you do. If you cast a Brainstorm, it's going to be 3 mana. If you Force of Will with your alternate casting cost of exiling a blue card, it's going to be 3 mana. You name it, it's going to cost you 3 mana. That's what Trinisphere does. So if you play this on turn 1, your opponent all of a sudden can't do anything until turn 3, and you make so much mana, it kind of breaks the symmetry anyway. So this buys you more time to get your smokestack down, and that's kind of the lock right there. If you have a Trinisphere and everything costs 3 mana, plus your opponent's having to sacrifice a permanent every single turn, how does your opponent ever do anything in those scenarios? It's very difficult for them to even play Magic. Then we also have Ensnaring Bridge, because why not? You don't want to lose to creatures, so get down your Ensnaring Bridge, makes it so it's hard for your opponent's creatures to attack you. You can get empty-handed, or you got the Wombo combo with Bottled Cloister, which makes you exile your hand at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep. So during your opponent's turn, you're going to be empty-handed, which means creatures just can't attack you if you have a bridge down. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you get all your cards back and you draw an extra card. And then we have Ratchet Bomb and Powder Keg. They're very similar, but they allow you to blow up a bunch of things of a converted mana cost, so removal essentially. Staff of Domination kind of does a bit of everything. Takes advantage of all the mana, gains you life, untaps things, taps things, even draws you a card if you have enough mana. And then, as far as winning the game, it's not going to happen quickly. This deck is not going to win quick. I would assume the most common way you win is actually your opponent just scooping in frustration when they can't do anything for like a million turns and they have nothing and they're locked. However, you can actually win with Mishra's Factory, and Crucible of Worlds helps, because even if your opponent kills your Mishra's Factory, you know he's going to back, so that's kind of the way you win eventually, is just slowly beating down with Mishra's Factory. I wanted to mention Wasteland with Crucible of Worlds too. That makes the lock even harder. You can Wasteland one of your opponent's lands every turn by getting it back with Crucible, which means they have to sack other permanents, like basic lands, for example, to the Smokestack lock. We have a bunch of other interesting lands, and this deck is actually colorless, so it gets away with playing a ton of powerful colorless lands because you don't need colored mana for anything. Inventor's Fair tutors up artifacts, gains you some life. Buried Ruin lets you get artifacts back from the graveyard. Karakas is a way to deal with like fast Emeralds and Grizzlebrands that people reanimate or sneak into play. In the sideboard, Lodestone Golem is super sweet because Lodestone Golem is great in this deck. It seems like an obvious main deck choice. The problem with Lodestone Golem is people just kill it. However, if you think back to the main deck, no real creatures. You got Mishra's Factory, but that doesn't really count. So no creatures, so odds are your opponent's going to just take out creature removal, and then you bring in Lodestone Golem after sideboarding and lock your opponent even harder. Phyrexian Revoker kind of works the same way. It's like a Pithing Needle on a stick, and then we have a couple of actual Pithing Needles. Fairy Macabre allows you to exile stuff from your opponent's graveyard. Really good answer to Reanimator strategies. Tormod Script, same way. Cohesive Portal is halfway a Wrath, but mostly it's a Howling Mine that draws you an extra card every turn. Your opponent has some control over it thanks to how the voting works, but it's a reasonable option. And then the Tabernacle at Pendrevale comes in against creature-heavy decks and is just another taxing effect where your opponent has to pay mana for every creature they want to keep around every upkeep, and because you're wastelanding them and locking them with Smokestack, it's going to be really hard for them to keep their creatures alive. And that is Stax for Legacy, and that's our Wildcard Wednesday instant deck tech for this week. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon.